Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Sarah Zenaida Gould, and I am Executive Director of the Mexican American Civil Rights Institute. Today, we are joined by 4 scholars who will help us understand several contemporary controversies in sports iconography. Our expert panelists will walk us through a history of stereotypes in sports mascots, why questions have been raised about the Eyes of Texas fight song, and what's controversial about referencing the Texas Revolution in sports teams' names and merchandise. I'd like to introduce our speakers tonight. They are Dr. Philip J. Deloria, Professor of History at Harvard University, where he himself made history as Harvard's first tenured professor of Native American history. Dr. Edmund T. Gordon, the University of Texas at Austin's Vice Provost for Diversity and founding chair emeritus of the African and African Diaspora Studies Department. Dr. Raúl Ramos, Associate Professor of History at the University of Houston, and Dr. Omar Valerio-Jiménez, Associate Professor of History at the University of Texas at San Antonio. Thank you so much to our panelists. I'd like to invite Dr. Deloria to begin the conversation.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and greetings to all and to my fellow panelists. I'm speaking to you from Massachusetts, ancestral territory of the Massachusetts people. And I want to talk a little bit tonight about Indian mascots. It's a complicated story that is both superficially about sports, but also about the deepest anxiety of Americans. And I think it has a lot to say about some of the other scenarios that we'll be talking about tonight. So one of the things that we can think about when we think about Indian mascots and where they came from is to point to the institutionalization of sports in the late 19th century. Baseball, that meant clubs and leagues. In football, that meant college programs. Spectator sports really kind of emerging at this particular moment. And that coincided with a particularly important and vexed moment in thinking about United States, and people about the United States thinking about their sense of national identity, and particularly relative to indigenous people. It's the moment when we talk about the closing of the frontier, about the last battles, about the arrival of various crises of modernity, about the emergence of primitivist movements that sought to recapture something authentic and vital, and oftentimes turn to Indian people and imaginary kind of Indian people to do so. Those things at that particular moment in time transform a history that was already existing or extant, in which Americans imagined Indians and then appropriated those imaginings for themselves. There's a scholar named Richard Slotkin who described this dynamic as early as the 1970s. He said, it's like this: be the Indian, kill the Indian. And those two actions were paired together. You became more like an Indian in order to successfully kill Indian people. You killed Indians, and then having killed them, you claimed that you, not them, were the true Aboriginal or indigenous inhabitants of the land. Today, scholars describe this dynamic using the concept of settler colonialism. It's not like regular colonialism, in which colonies extract labor and resources and then return home. Settlers in settler colonialism come to stay, which means that they see things differently. They're not in a two-way relationship between sort of an empire and a colonized space. They're in a three-way relationship. Themselves on the one hand, the home country on the other hand, and the indigenous people of the lands on the third hand. And they're always pinging back and forth. They look at the indigenous and they think, well, this is like me when I look back over at England, for example. But then they look back at England and they say, yeah, see, I'm civilized like that, and I'm not like these indigenous folks. They're always looking back and forth. And it makes it complicated for people to sort of think about their collective identities. So as scholars have described it, these settlers develop something we can call a logic of elimination. Kill the Indian, right? Or at least minimize or contain or diminish them. They're not content to be colonies, these settler colonies, but instead they found and part of the nationalist imperative of those political orders, right? What is it? Part of that comes with a claim to be indigenous. So kill the Indian, be the Indian. So the United States actually has a very long history in which non-native people dress up like Indians. And as sports teams became very interested in team names, uniforms, symbols, logos, and eventually mascots, and we can point to the early 20th century for this, it was both logical and traditional for them to turn to Indians. Football, in particular, because it's a game of territorial conquest, was a particularly evocative location for this kind of thing. So imagine Indians and pioneers. My kids who went to Ann Arbor Pioneer High School, right, are part of the other side of this legacy. Imagine Indians and pioneers squaring off in the football field over a war over yardage. It's no coincidence that the Carlisle Indian School teams, right, this Carlisle Indian School full of native performers or native athletes, that these Carlisle Indian School teams were particularly noted for their aggressive and indeed their very smart play. And that this in turn helped consolidate certain narratives or stories that have proven quite durable. When you hear people say, our team is the Indians because we are fierce warriors like they were, this is part and parcel of that kind of imaginary that we're talking about. I think it's equally important to note that this kind of Indian play had always been playful. That is to say, fun for the people who were doing it, carnivalesque, alcohol-fueled. We can trace drunken, sometimes belligerent fun like this, or fun with Indians, back to the drinking clubs of Pennsylvania of the 18th century and all the way through the 19th century and into the 20th. And over the course of the 20th century, a great location for fun and creativity has been in the vernacular fan culture of professional and college sports. So for our teams, we invent songs and cheers and chants and body gestures and rituals and tokens of good luck, and of course, mascots. Fans have had fun doing this. It creates social bonds that are meaningful and important. And it was completely consistent with the full range of American history to do this with Indian. So one might ask, why has it been so hard to question or to challenge this kind of practice? It doesn't take a rocket scientist, I don't think, to understand that at a certain point, when actual Indian people, native people, take offense, that you can have a realization that these mascots and rituals might really be kind of a bad idea. But the drunken fan, I will say, is the honest fan. And that person does not hesitate to say what they take to be the truth. It usually goes something like this. Hey, we won, and so we'll do what we want. You lost, and so you should just get over it, right? This is the thing that people tell native protesters, that fans tell native protesters over and over again, get over it. That's not happening, by the way. So the fundamental dynamic at work here has been one of uneven power. Fan culture has a lot of power. Professional culture, college sports do too. Indians, not so much, right? Demographically, native folks are deeply outnumbered. Economically and politically, they're often, usually, at a disadvantage. The legal route, which once seemed modestly promising, was closed off in 2017 when the Supreme Court rejected an attempt to invoke the Lanham Act, piece of legislation that said you couldn't register a racist or disparaging trademark. Supreme Court, in effect, ruled that trademarks could be racist since it was a free speech issue. So that leaves a cultural struggle, right? 50 years of protests, letters, and pleas to change. And this has been largely successful in many, many places. Not so much in professional sports, we can add. The most prominent response to Indian objections has simply been that the institutions and fans behind mascotry simply do not care and don't need to care. They ignore the protests, in other words. Second response has been to try to control the conversation. The most common way this happens is to say that a team and its fans are not mocking, disparaging, stereotyping, or insulting Indian people when they wear turkey feather headdresses of 100 different colors and make up fake pidgin languages. But instead, they're honoring Indians, right? This honoring thing, which we hear all too often. Third strategy has been to insist that protesting Indian people are not actually representative. So there have been a series of incredibly lame and basically fake polls that have sucked in the likes of Sports Illustrated and Washington and the Washington Post, journalistic institutions that ought to be a little less credulous about these things. And in fact, in the case of the Post, which sponsored some of these bogus polls, perhaps in support of their team, these folks should be more honest about their interests and maybe better at their business. The changing situations in Washington and Cleveland are representative, I think, of just how hard it is for Native folks to be drivers of change around this issue. The context for the name changes in those places was, of course, the death of George Floyd and the massive, if now being reframed and somewhat fading in our collective memories, the massive protests against histories and structures of racial injustice. In the midst of that came a dim sense that perhaps it wasn't all just an African-American thing. And thus we had BIPOC, right? Black, Indigenous, and people of color, although the I for Indigenous was still pretty thin. In Washington, it was corporate sponsorship, money, ownership struggles, and a massive sexual harassment crisis that helped drive the name change. In Cleveland, the process involved player protests and a slowly growing sensitivity on the part of the Dolan family, the ownership, to whom I am actually willing to offer some kudos. I had interesting conversations with them along the way. So, two bottom lines. Here's one. Mascots, logos, symbols, and so on do in fact do harm. As Stephanie Freiberg and others have shown, that harm takes multiple forms. First, there's the content of the stereotyping and the insulting, the negative ideas and images that become internalized in Native young people and in non-Native young people, both of whom are then patterned and programmed to act on the resulting beliefs and schemas that represent Native people in negative terms. Second, and perhaps more to the point, Freiberg has shown that there is a kind of meta consequence, a bigger consequence, that young Native children also experience the powerlessness of their leaders, their family, their elders, their people, and that this revelation of powerlessness and of uncaring power that sits somewhere else is just as devastating psychologically. Because what is the point of doing anything if you can never move power? Activists cannot believe that lesson, but children do, and with serious consequences. And I think it has ramifications for the larger conversations we're involved in today. Second bottom line, I am a modest sports fan, and I was lucky to grow up with good team names. In school, the Mustangs, the Farmers of Wheat Ridge, Colorado, the Buffaloes, the Wolverines, the Crimson. In my hometown, the Bears, the Broncos, Rockies, Avalanche, Nuggets, Lions, Tigers, Pistons, Red Sox, Celtics. Celtics, right? What to make of that? And the point is this, actually, that team names and mascots are not meant to honor anything. A basketball team in Boston is not honoring Celtic concept to talk about this stuff. Honoring is work, solemn for the most part. Sports are not a commemoration either. They're not memory work. They're not public history, although those things may be part of a team's cultural infrastructure. To claim that they are is just wrong. What team names and mascots do so well and so importantly is to bring a community together in a context that is fun, that admits perhaps even a bit of alcohol-fueled craziness, that encourages the creativity of vernacular fan culture, and that allows people to high-five and to cheer together, to look at their neighbors and to see someone like themselves. A name or a mascot, a logo, a symbol, a flag, whatever, that does not bring together, that excludes anyone, is by definition a failure. Minor League Baseball has this figured out, and it turns out to be not all that hard. And I should note, they change the name of these teams all the time. Consider a few from my own beloved Northwoods League. My sometime team, the Traverse City Pit Spitters, which is just a harmless riff on the cherry growing culture of Northern Michigan. And I should note that they changed the name about 4 or 5 years ago from the Traverse City Beach Bums, a pretty friendly riff on the fact that there's nice beaches up here. The Wisconsin Woodchucks, who one night renamed themselves the Wisconsin Udder Pullers to reference the Wisconsin dairy industry. The Rockford Rivets, the Rochester Honkers, named after geese, the La Crosse Loggers, the Green Bay Bullfrogs, and the Mankato Moondogs. These are names that are trying to be inclusive of a full and diverse community. They may not be perfect for everyone in every instance, but they recognize locality, local culture, local history, local quirkiness. They recognize there has to be some fun baked into it all, but they know that the fun cannot come at the expense of other people who ought to be part of that community. The fun comes when people are willing to poke fun at themselves, and that they've worked hard to find symbols that might actually allow that to happen. And so I want to close with just a couple of possible guidelines. Local character and community expressed with a sense of humility and self-deprecation. Self-awareness and consultation with the aim of maximum inclusion and no exclusion. A sense of fun and play, recognizing that fan culture will create things based on whatever template a team offers. And finally, no pompous claims that a sports team name has a role in honoring or commemorating much of anything. That's not what sports is about. Sports has a lot of good stuff to it, right? But when we let sports go down the road where it becomes an exclusionary and an insulting kind of exercise, right, that's when sports actually fails. And I will stop there and look forward to our conversation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Deloria. I would like to invite Dr. Gordon to share.
Sure, and I do have something to share on the screen. Let me see if I can get it up there. It's been not working. I may not be able to share it on the screen. Let's try this. Can you see that? Eyes of Texas.
It's working. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. All right. Well, I've been asked to talk about the controversy that's erupted over the Eyes of Texas, which is the spirit song of the University of Texas at Austin. And this is a spirit song, but it's a pretty serious issue here in Austin, Texas, and in Texas in general. People have received death threats around this issue. People have lost their jobs around this issue. There's tens of millions of dollars inexplicably associated with this issue. It emerges out of a pretty, what seems at first glance, benign history. This gentleman who is featured here back in 1903 was after writing a song, a spirit song for the University of Texas, which at that time was only about 2 decades old, and didn't have a school song. So he and a couple of buddies got together to try to write a school song, and they wrote an original version of it. But at that point, some of those same friends decided they were going to put on a minstrel show. And it was a minstrel show that was the first held by and put on by University of Texas students. And it was put on to raise money for the track team. And so what they did was they changed some of the lyrics of the song that they had hoped would be a school song to be a parody. And it was basically a parody of the president of the university, a guy by the name of Prather. So they got out there, they performed in the minstrel show, they sang this parody song with the refrain, "The Eyes of Texas," which was attributed to, actually it was something that Prather had said on a number of occasions to the students, particularly when he was reprimanding them. This is actually a cartoon from your book in which Prather is dressing down Carrie Nation, the famous prohibitionist, who the students were egging on in confrontation with him, right? So, and at that occasion, supposedly, Prather said, well, you know, you students need to be a little bit more under control because the eyes of Texas are upon you. So in the parody, in a minstrel show, those of you know anything about minstrel shows back at the turn of the century and well into the mid-20th century were generally performed in blackface. And they were not only parodies of known figures in a carnivalesque kind of atmosphere, but they were also parodies of blackness. And in fact, solidarity amongst a relatively diverse class and regionally diverse group of folks, of white folks, in a place like Austin, Texas, and at a university like the University of Texas, solidarity was created at least in part on the basis of racial solidarity. And so the performance of Black Parody was part of that. Here's some UT students. This is actually from 1911, doing just that, performing in blackface. So this was a relatively popular art form, if you want to call it art, parody form that actually remained in place until the 1960s, and I'll say about that, something about that in a little bit. The words to the eyes of Texas were not immediately taken up or recognized as being important or particularly popular, but by the time we get to a few years later, by the time we get to I believe this is from 1918, but by the time we get to 1915, the yearbook is already taking the main stanza or the chorus of the song and has made it into a symbol of the university. By the time you get to the 1920s, another interesting thing has happened. The song is understood. On the right-hand side of your screen is John Sinclair Lewis, who wrote the lyrics to the song in parody of the gentleman who is right there in the middle, who is President Prather, president at the time. He actually died in 1905. And Prather actually had been a student of Robert E. Lee at Washington College, which is now Washington and Lee College in Virginia. And by the 1920s, the myth has it that the eyes of Texas is a paraphrasing by Prather of Lee's notion of the eyes of the South are upon you, or statement of the eyes of the South are upon you. There's no historical, in those historical records that a lot of us have gone through, there is no clear indication that Lee said those words. By the 1920s, what has become the school song is associated with Lee and the Lost Cause. And this is in the context of a burgeoning white supremacy. This is Austin, Texas in 1921, in which 500 Klansmen marched down Congress Avenue in front of something around 30,000 people, which was more or less the size of the entire city of Austin. So what that meant is that people came from the countryside to flock in and to celebrate the Klan and to celebrate the kind of upwelling of white supremacy that included in it this notion of the lost cause, as symbolized both by Robert E. Lee, but also by, to a certain extent, in one way, the Eyes of Texas is the school song of the university. This tradition of blackface minstrelsy on the campus of the University of Texas begun in that first minstrel show back in May 12th, 1903, in which the Eyes of Texas as a song was first sung. That tradition lasted right through the 1940s and up until the 1960s, in which, due to student protest at a now integrated University of Texas, minstrelsy as a performance tradition died out by students. But of course, the Eyes of Texas as a spirit song outlived the minstrel shows where it was first performed. Now, that history was more or less known by many of us over time, but students and others did have that general knowledge, and if they did, the significance of the relationship between the Eyes of Texas and its performance in blackface wasn't really, didn't become a rallying cry or something that people were upset about overly. Some of us were, but students in general weren't until after the murder of George Floyd. Dr. Deloria was just talking about that as a signal, unfortunate set of circumstances that led to a general racial uprising, or at least the recognition of the racialized conditions in U.S. society. And in that context, students, and uniquely at the University of Texas, athletes began making demands of the university in relationship to the various kinds of symbols that students found to be problematic in terms of their racial representations. And the Eyes of Texas was one of those. So athletes, amongst other students, there were 16,000 students, UT students, who signed a petition in which the Eyes of Texas was one of the many things that they were objecting to. But athletes objected to this. And when athletes got involved, then things really got serious, because when athletes become involved, particularly football players, then you're touching the university, or at least the University of Texas, at its heart. You're touching an industry, if you want to call it that, which is worth something around $200 million a year to the university. It is also at the very center of the university's development efforts. UT Athletics is a huge generator of alumni support, and particularly alumni financial support. And when the athletes began talking about the university changing its traditions of playing the University of Texas and having people stand and genuflect to it, salute to it, things got really serious. And in fact, behind the scenes, it turns out there were a number of rich donors and other folks, ex-football players, many of them wealthy as well, who were quite energized about this and who threatened to pull their donations and their support from the University of Texas. In response, the president of the University of Texas, in the eye of a controversy, made a number of concessions to students and to athletes in relation to changing some building names and putting up some other kind of commemorations of Black and other folks, committed money to the recruitment of more Black students, and a series of other kinds of things. But what he did not do was he did not say that the university would abandon the Eyes of Texas as its school song. What he did do was he commissioned a committee composed of, there were 3 or 4 professional historians, people from the UT faculty on this committee, but there were also representatives, a representative from the UT band, which also had refused to play the Eyes of Texas. There were student government representatives, there were other faculty members, there were a few staff members, and this committee was supposed to study the history of the Eyes of Texas, so as to be able to have the university come to terms with its past as represented by the song. So the committee did that work. And as a result of that work, they came up with findings. Those findings, I'll read you some of those findings. These historical facts add complexity and richness to the story of a song that debuted in a racist setting, exceedingly common for the time, but as the predominance of research showed, had no racist intent, in that it was intended to parody the famous phrase of the university president. However, systemic racial intent existed in the setting and culture where the song debuted. The exclusion of Black students at that time presents an opportunity to think about how they and other communities of color have fought for inclusion and work that remains to ensure all members of our community feel that they belong. Right? So the other thing that they said was that the Eyes of Texas did not, as a song, did not have racist intent, but that the song was always about accountability. And therefore, the spirit and intention of the song compels the university to be transparent about its past and be ever more accountable to the state and its diverse people. Now, of course, there were large sections of the student and faculty and other communities that found it difficult to believe or to accept the notion that a song originally sung in blackface and then reproduced in, the explicitly racist settings of minstrelsy had no racial intent. But what's interesting here is what this indicates about how we understand what racism is and how racism operates in this society and what constitutes racism. This is actually something that's at the forefront of what the folks are thinking about in relationship to critical race theories and others. Because to say that something has racist intent, there is the current legal standard is that if it has racist intent, then it is racist behavior. However, if it's just systematic racism, as the report came out and said, it's not legally problematic. So the committee, in one way or another, positioned the song as not being of racist intent and therefore not racist in its intent, and therefore declaring that it could still have the properties of a song or of a spirit song which could unite the UT community. And so the UT Regents backed the president of the university, stating that the Eyes of Texas is and will remain the official school song. And despite continued protests by folks like the students and NAACP and other folks, the song remains and will be played and sung, and athletes will be expected to stand on the field when the University of Texas plays Louisiana on Saturday.
Wow. Thank you for that. I imagine when we get to the end, we can put this into conversation with some of these other things we've heard about. But let us now go over to Dr. Raúl Ramos.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you again for the invitation to participate in this conversation that really is bringing, a continental and a global history together. And so this, and of course, in a timely way, I want to begin by I'm speaking to you from Houston, which is on the Gulf Coast. And as such is the home to a number of historically to a number of indigenous communities, Karankawa, Coahuiltecan, Atacapa, Ishak, and Sana peoples, and also as neighbors on the Gulf Coast with folks in New Orleans who are currently suffering the effects of a massive hurricane, and so are we feel connected to this area in multiple hurricanes coming through here in the last decade. And at this time, I think it's we as Dr. Deloria mentioned, there is a sort of national discussion taking place. You kind of feel it ebbing and flowing and coming and going, and certainly not unrelated to the pandemic and the way we are having this conversation today. The need to come together, the inability to come together at times has only made those moments when we do much more powerful. And really, what are these athletic events, these school events, but moments of coming together? I'm at a big public institution in Texas as well, and much of our budget goes to supporting athletics and the football team. On the other hand, I don't know any other time when there's 40,000 plus people all in one place cheering for the school and really coming together in this sort of day-long community. And it really is. I mean, you should. It takes place mostly outside of the football field, as it does in many places in the country. But really, I feel you really get a sense of the Houston community, the Gulf Coast community, when you walk around the campus on those game days. So I understand what coming together, how important coming together is, and we need that at some elemental level. We also need to acknowledge and accept everyone. And there's a way that limiting, closing off, or making exclusive one particular narrative of history has a way of cutting entire members of our community, parts of our own self, in a almost violent act of cutting the past off in order to make one particular story more important or primary and privileged in our culture. And that's certainly the case when it comes to the history of Texas and the history of the so-called Texas Revolution. I think one of the reason we've come together is because UT San Antonio has a logo, a motto that they use with their sports teams, and Dr. Valerio-Jiménez will speak more onto that. So I don't want to go into that right now, but I will talk about essentially the politics of the Texas Revolution and of Texas history, and how it's come together with sports at various times. And there's a way that the conversation around the how we talk about the Confederacy, which is not a new conversation, but one that after Charlottesville and after various moments has focused on particular public commemoration, statues, the names of schools, the names of buildings, the names of streets, and so we've been in the middle of over a decade of reconsideration of that past, understanding the impact the lost cause narrative had on Southern history, on American history, on American identity, and so we've been having that conversation as a nation, and somehow Texas got a pass. It wasn't really included in that conversation. Certainly, Texas was a state in the Confederacy, and the vote to secede was overwhelming in Texas. So it wasn't accidentally. So now it wasn't a theater really in terms of where battles took place, but it certainly was a member of the Confederacy. But in many ways, and even in Texas, here in Houston, the Houston Independent School District changed the name of 5 or 6 schools. I live down the street from the former Jefferson Davis High School, which is now Northside High School. So some of those are pretty straightforward. And there were controversies even changing the name of Davis High School. And in particular, though, the Texas Revolution, Texas history hasn't had the same kind of scrutiny in terms of how it privileges one particular aspect of its story and how it has an impact on the people in the state. And when you do bring up 19th century Texas history, there is a way that the focus, the weight, the significance of the Texas Revolution and the story of the Alamo has on that telling that dominates the story, that becomes the sort of center of that discussion, and I believe not accidentally so. When you go to visit the Alamo, you'll see that when you walk in, you're told to take off your hat, that you're in a shrine to Texas Liberty, that it's the birthplace of Texas Liberty, and in particular, I want to focus on that, the idea of that it's the birthplace of Texas, and that's not by accident. That it's, when we talk about birth, we're talking about beginnings. That means that what came before that is not important, is not part of what comes after. It literally cuts history at that point. Jeannie O'Brien has a book that looks at New England looking at it, at the way Indigenous people are talked about in New England as the last of so-and-so people and the first of this community. So talking about first, the book is called First Thing and Lasting, and there's ways that when we talk about the birthplace of a place, it has a larger impact on the story and of who you're talking about and who's included in that story. So my larger question is, where do I belong? Where do I belong in Texas history? And I think that's a question we're not allowed to even ask. The assumption is that you belong by repeating it. That's how you're included. That's how you belong. But certainly, you just have to look beyond the walls of the Alamo, and you see 4 other missions. You see indigenous communities to the west. You see amount of slavery that existed in Texas in the 1830s and in the Republic period, and we see that it's a much more complicated history, and one that we're starting to have that conversation now. But it's clear that as we're starting to have that conversation, there's sort of more digging in that's taking place, and so it's that conversation, how we've framed that conversation, how we have that conversation, that is important. And what I'm seeing is that anytime you even begin to have the conversation, the pushback happens almost right away. I was in some ways asked to participate in this around sports teams because Houston has its own history around the Texas Revolution and sports team. This has to do with our current Major League Soccer team, the Houston Dynamo, which weren't always called the Dynamo. Here, I'm going to put the logo of the team. The team was formerly the San Jose Earthquakes, and like many teams, when San Jose Earthquakes wanted a new stadium, and they asked the city to build them one, and the city refused. This is a common story. So they said, we're going to take our soccer ball and leave, and they did. And Major League Soccer has more control than some other leagues over the teams, and said, well, you can leave, but you have to. But we want to keep a team in San Jose, and we want to keep the name Earthquakes there. So you have to come up with a new team in Houston. In any case, Houston Earthquakes would sound sort of odd, although not unheard of, right? Not any more odd than the Utah Jazz or the Los Angeles Lakers. So, or the Los Angeles Dodgers, for that matter. So the Houston team needed to come up with a new name, and after some time and looking around, the team decided on one, and they chose, and I will show you here the logo they came up with. They chose Houston 1836. They had this big announcement at actually my niece's middle school in the auditorium, and everyone sort of half-heartedly clapped, not sure what to make of the name. Now, naming a team after a significant year is not unheard of either, right? We have the Philadelphia 76ers, we have the San Francisco 49ers. And so in that way, Houston, this is a city that decided to name their football team the Texans after they lost the Oilers. So, they sort of wanted to stick to something Texas identified. And so they went with Houston 1836. And right away, sort of felt something wasn't right about this name, because again, as a Texas historian, I felt, well, hang on a second here. On the one hand, this is great. This is a chance to talk about the 19th century. I love talking about the 19th century, but I didn't get the feeling that was the reason for naming the team in 1836, especially when you look at the logo itself, and on the top you have the famous statue of Sam Houston on horseback with his sword drawn, charging at the Battle of San Jacinto. It's actually the statue that's at Herman Park off of Main Avenue here in Houston. So it was clear that the signal was, this is 1836, which, by the way, is the year of the founding of Houston, but it's also the year that the Mexican army was defeated at San Jacinto by Sam Houston and his army, and Santa Anna essentially gave up control of Texas. So I wrote an editorial at that point saying, it seems a little odd to have Mexican people, which I assume were going to be a large portion of the fans, wearing shirts that commemorate the defeat of the Mexican army at the soccer games, and in order to support the team. And so I wrote an editorial to that effect. I got called a lot of names, and occasionally do when these things happen, especially when you're a state employee. And yet the team, I think, largely for financial reasons, looked around. And this is a time when these questions were already being asked around about teams like the football team in Washington and baseball team in Cleveland, that perhaps this is not the way to start. This is sort of starting off on the wrong foot, as it were. And so the team pulled the name, and they came up with Houston Dynamo, which actually there's there's a team in Russia, the Dynamo. I think it's a Kiev team. In any case, it's a team it's a name that signifies future and energy, and can be said in Spanish as well as in English. And so it seems to have stuck, and folks are pretty happy. That being said, for a few years afterwards, occasionally I would get a phone call from the marketing department at the team whenever they would have a new advertising campaign, and at one point they wanted to make a campaign around "Come and Take It," and so they asked me, "What do you think about that?" So in this case, I'm asking a historian to pre-clear essentially a advertising campaign, and I said, "Look, you all do whatever you want to do, but here's the historical background, which around 1836, around the Come and Take It, and not only that, but it's become this Second Amendment really kind of appropriated saying. So you're having to deal with all of that whenever you start taking one of these campaigns. So I think I don't quite remember what they ended up doing. I don't think they went with the campaign, but it shows that this was a team that realized that they wanted to have that kind of conversation ahead of time. That being said, we're still not at the point where we can have these conversations easily. We're at the point where, when you bring this question up, when I brought it up around the soccer team, when we're bringing this question up now around UT San Antonio and their campaign, people are surprised. Kind of the same way they were surprised around the Eyes of Texas. I would say folks say, "Well, what do you mean? What's wrong with this? What's the problem? Why do you have a problem with it?" And that's what I see happening a lot of the time in discussions around what something means. It said, well, a group of people feel it means something else, but it's a group set apart from the norm. The normal people, of course, would think there's nothing wrong with it, but you're not normal by seeing that there's something that could be destructive around this particular version of history. So in some ways, this question has even come up in our legislature. By the way, if for those of you who aren't in Texas you take Texas history in the 4th grade and again in the 7th grade. And I teach Texas history at the university level, and my Texas history class will count for one of your American history required introductory courses. And again, in Texas, all public higher education graduates are required to take 2 semesters of U.S. history. And I ask my students all the time, why do you feel the state requires this Texas history, requires U.S. history? And it's not just to hire more historians, although that's great. I'm not arguing with that. But it's in many ways, these requirements came up in the 1950s. In the 1940s and really in the 1950s, right around the time that, folks thought, singing the Eyes of Texas was a way of becoming part of this institution, becoming part of a place. And so there is a way that that these requirements come at a time when there was a growing, when higher education was becoming more diverse and continues to become more diverse. And there's even more pressure to have this one narrative, this one story, this one singular story that begins with the birth of Texas at the Alamo. And as historians, of course, I ask my students, am I here to teach you to be patriotic, or teach you, or am I here to ask questions? And so it's in this idea of as historians, we look at not just how we got to where we are, but what it took and what's keeping us here, what's holding us back. And this is one of those things that it seems to me is holding us back. Dr. Deloria brought up this question of play. And in some ways that really resonated for me in the opposite way, in the sense that it's almost impossible to joke about the Texas Revolution, and there's very little that's playful about it. And I saw this sort of most recently with a big trade history of the Texas Revolution called "Forget the Alamo," which is, I think, ironically titled because it's mostly about the Alamo. So it's a great history of the Alamo, but it's done in a very playful way and in a very irreverent way. And I think it's that irreverence in some ways that's really hit essentially a nerve, caused a lot of the pushback on that story, because honestly, that story they're telling is not new. Historians have been telling this story for at least 50, 60, 70 years now. Americo Paredes was telling this story at UT Austin, and when Walter Prescott Webb was down the hallway. And so this story, this alternative narrative, these other narratives, what I like to feel is really reconnecting the past to the present versus the severing of the past and the present, is something that we continue to work to do as historians, and have to feel that that's that reconnection that's going to help create more authentic participation in our institutions and our communities, versus, I hate to use a term like this. I was thinking of this idea of blackface. There's a way that you can that you were limited, when you were young, you would go and if you were Chicano Mexican and you were in school, you have to retell the story of the Alamo in whiteface. I mean, that's essentially what you're doing is you're performing a particular version of the story, that's not your story, right? That's not that has very little of it is where you can very little of it where you can find yourself. And so it's that the inability to see that story is not authentic, is not organic. That's one of the biggest barriers that I see as a historian.
Thank you so much, Raúl. I am going to bring Omar to, or invite Omar to present now. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much for the invitation. And I'm really happy to be participating on this panel with the distinguished scholars and friends, colleagues. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the recent controversy began at the beginning of this month, early August. And I'm gonna show some slides, and I'm basically gonna just tell the story, and I'm not gonna provide as much analysis because it's been so recent. And I also I think it's good to sort of follow up with what Dr. Ramos had sort of mentioned in terms of the significance and sort of inability to tell the story or to question the story of the so-called birth of the Republic of Texas. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen here. All right. Okay. All right. So, and I'll explain what the race means in a little while. So, UTSA broke ground on a building, $41.5 million building in March 2020. The so-called race building, the Roadrunner Athletic Center of Excellence, promised to elevate the UTSA's athletic program and draw world-class student athletes to its Division I programs. It's nearly 95,000 square feet large. It's located on 10.8 acres on the school's main campus, and it includes practice fields, locker rooms, a sports medicine center, and strength and conditioning facilities. So you might ask, what does this have to do with the Come and Take It slogan and flag, right? So the grand opening of the race building was on August 4th. I think it was at a Wednesday of earlier this month, which was celebrated in the local media reports. And these reports had photos of a large Come and Take It sign within the building. You can see it at the bottom of this photo, but you'll see it in a little while in another slide. Okay, so this is some of this is taken from the grand opening, and there was people lining up. There was a video that UT Athletics shared on Twitter, and it showed various people coming to the grand opening, and several of the visitors taking a selfie with the large Come and Take It sign in the back, and it's massive, as you can sort of see. So when these news reports came out, faculty, staff, and students who read these news reports about the race building were quite surprised to learn that the UTSA football team was using this slogan, and it also had developed this tradition during the fourth quarter of their football games. So soon, over the weekend, basically, an online petition appeared that explained the inappropriateness of this slogan and asked UTSA to remove it. The petition soon garnered close to 900 signatures, or over 900 signatures. As a result, the UTSA administration responded rather quickly. But before we get to there, I want to explain a little bit about the canon, the Come and Take It flag, and so forth. So in 1831, and this is just going to be a brief overview, the Mexican government lent a small cannon to Anglo-American colonists who had settled in Gonzales, so they could defend themselves against Native Americans. And it's never explained why they were defending themselves against Native Americans, but anyway, the Mexican government stipulated, they said, we'll lend you this cannon on the condition that you return the cannon when we ask you to do so. So 4 years later, Colonel Domingo de Ugartechea, a military commander here in San Antonio, sent 6 soldiers to retrieve the cannon. But the colonists at Gonzales refused to return the cannon and actually took the soldiers prisoner. So Ugartechea sent 100 soldiers to retrieve the cannon, and this led to the so-called Battle of Gonzales, which was considered the first battle of the Texas secessionist movement. So the news reports describe the controversy that, the news reports that came out over the weekend, basically after the grand opening, and cited several professors and staff who were quite surprised at the slogan's use, at the football team's use of this slogan. And by Monday, the president of the university, President Amy, had responded basically 5 days after the initial story, by August 9th. And this is one of the news reports that came out, one of several that came out. On the same day, on August 9th, an op-ed piece appeared by Elaine Ayala that describes sort of a series of what one faculty member called forced errors by UTSA's administration in recent years. So in recent years, UTSA had claimed to be a Hispanic thriving institution, despite what faculty and staff at the university have criticized the administration for its lack of Latinas and Latinos in positions of leadership. There was also another controversy that the columnist Elena Ayala mentioned, which was in 2020, there was the abrupt dismissal of the UTSA's staff at the Institute of Texan Cultures. And so Ayala made this very wise observation in her column, and she said, the university didn't need to push its luck, especially when the role of slavery and racism in the Texas Revolution has been drawing fresh scrutiny. And I'll mention here that many, I think, faculty and staff were quite surprised to learn that this come and take it slogan had been adopted back in 2011, which I'll mention in a little while. Anyway, so why is this come and take it slogan offensive to some people, right? Well, the Texas secessionist movement led to the creation of the Texas Republic that existed from 1836 to 1845. This republic has had a constitution, its founding constitution, that re-legalized the enslavement of African people. It was also a republic that led to an explosion of anti-Mexican violence, as many Anglo-Texans confused a people, meaning Tejanos, with the government, Mexico's centralist government. And finally, and there's other things, but I'll just mention three things. The Texas Republic also is a period when the Republic's government launched various aggressive military expeditions against Native American nations within the Republic. So the UTSA's president responded by acknowledging the controversy. He sent out an email to all faculty and staff and students, to the university community. And then it also appeared on UTSA's website, explaining how individuals have different historical perspectives about the come and take it slogan. His email had a subject line, exploring our traditions. And in it, he acknowledged that the come and take it flag had been used and slogan had been used recently by, quote, several political movements and causes. And it also made its way into, quote, political protest on the grounds of the Texas state capitol. And then he ended his letter, shown here, with a series of questions that he stated would be addressed by a task force that he was going to create once the semester starts, which he's in the process of creating now. And the questions, he said, as we look at some of our traditions, we should ask these sort of questions. And then he posed a series of them, and I'll just read a few of them. And he said, in what context were they developed? Do they still align with who we are and who we serve and where our bright future is? Are these opportunities to begin new traditions and perhaps retire others that do not reflect that future? Anyway, and he went on, right? Hearing Dr. Gordon's presentation about the Eyes of Texas controversy at the University of Texas at Austin, I was reminded about how, the creation of a task force and what this task force finds and so forth, and how perhaps, even though research is done on the origins of this slogan and so forth, how scholars, at least, and the university community might have some very limited power. Anyway, the petition that was created online on change.org generated quite a bit of support. Support also appeared from various Mexican American and African American community organizations, politicians, residents of the city, as well as scholars. However, UTSA football fans reacted in some ways, in different ways, but there was quite a good segment of them that reacted in a very hostile manner. And several of them were actually Latino or Mexican Americans from the names that they displayed, on social media or on the newspaper's website. I've also heard recently that there's some conservative politicians and donors that have urged the UTSA administration to keep the slogan and the sign at the race building. Some of the faculty involved in the petition actually received threats in the comment section of the newspaper as well as on social media. Now, I'm not sure if back in 2011, when the football team was inaugurated, began here at UTSA, and when the slogan was adopted, I'm not really sure if the UTSA's administration or its athletic program actually consulted any historians of Texas when they chose this slogan. I didn't join the faculty here at UTSA until 2015. But after this controversy erupted, I thought, well, so now I was surprised that it had been adopted back in 2011. So I did just a really quick sort of database search in online newspapers through our main library's database, and I found several articles dated 2010, and I did a very narrow search. I just thought, well, let's look in the last, before 2011, the last 5 years. Were there any newspaper articles about the Come and Take It slogan and how it's been reappropriated by certain extremist groups? And I found several, and it didn't take long. It took less than 30 minutes. And I'm gonna and that's what you're seeing here. I'm sorry, so I forgot to mention. You're seeing newspaper. These are from 3 different newspapers, all of 2010, describing how sort of extremist, sort of pro-gun groups had appropriated the slogan, and some of them had protested at talks given by then President Barack Obama, and carrying, the paraphernalia, the T-shirts and the flags. And I felt that even a very sort of brief search would have told the administration, like, you might want to reconsider, right? So President Amy's message mentioned that the Come and Take It slogan had been used recently by various political movement and causes, and at protest on the grounds of this Texas state capitol. More specifically, I would say, well, what I think that message left out is that it's been used by very extremist nationalist militias and pro-gun groups. And here it is. You can see it on the left there. The Come and Take It flag, sort of a combination of the Texas flag, sort of perhaps the Come and Take It cannon flag, and a sort of militia flag. This is one of the flags at the Capitol Hill insurrection on January 6th. The slogan has also been adopted by various activists, by abortion rights activists, by marijuana enthusiasts, and even by McDonald's, I found out. Finally, what I wanted to ask, and in my presentation today, was, given the extremist groups' sort of use of the slogan and the flag, I wonder if this is the association that UTSA Athletics wants to promote. Thank you very much, and I'll be very happy to take questions and engage in a discussion. And let me stop sharing my screen. Okay.
Thank you so much, everyone, for all of that great information. I think that one of the reasons I was interested in having this conversation with you today was that I don't think that a lot of people necessarily know the background of how these things came to be. Maybe they've only heard about the controversy. And so providing that backstory I thought was important, especially because when we think about sports fandoms can be very powerful. They have a lot of influence. Several of you mentioned donors making kind of threats about money. That combination of traditions that people hold dearly and then money, it starts to get complicated, right? I wanted to start out with a question, and that's in particular, when we think about the Texas Revolution and we think about how aspects of the Texas Revolution get commemorated as heroic, and that these were heroes fighting for liberty, we sometimes forget the issue of slavery. And so I'm just wondering if in particular, I'm thinking maybe Dr. Ramos and Dr. Valerio-Jiménez want to talk about the role of slavery when we're talking about the Texas Revolution.
I'll let Dr. Ramos begin, perhaps. He wrote a book about, the Alamo, which is an excellent book, and I was gonna put a photo up, but I thought he might, so I'm sorry I didn't.
It's a little bit of a bait and switch. It's called Beyond the Alamo, so I only have 2 pages on the Alamo itself. And this is exactly the point in some ways. It feels like when, but at the moment that Texas is changing, that through the early 20th century, at the same time that essentially all these institutions are white dominated, white exclusive, when Mexican Americans, when African Americans start entering into the institutions of higher education, you start to see very conscious efforts at cutting off any possible discussion of the role of slavery in Texas, particularly because it would link it with the Confederacy. That was Texas wanted to celebrate, didn't want a lost cause narrative. They wanted a one cause narrative. And in many ways, to talk about slavery would link Texas even further into that story of the Confederacy. So it was a way of kind of having your cake and eating it too, in some ways, to not talk about the significance of slavery. And certainly that is undeniable. Andrew Torgett's book, Seeds of Empire, very, very extensively documents the ties between the prices of cotton in London and New York, and the essentially separatist fervor that grew hand in hand. And we only need to look at the documents. One of the things that you hear a lot in current legislature is that, well, we need a document-based history, and you also hear a lot about patriotic history. And in many ways, I don't know if folks are aware that this particular legislature passed legislation to establish what they call the 1836 Project. Clearly a nod to President Trump's 1776 Commission to establish an 1836 project that would extol patriotic education through Texas and the Valley, what they literally call 1836 values. Well, when I look at 1836 values that they're talking about, all you have to do is look at as Dr. Valerio-Jiménez mentioned, looking at the Republic of Texas Constitution, which not only made slavery the law of the land, it went so far as to say that you could not be free and black in Texas, period. That you just couldn't be here. You had to leave the state, and that slavery could not be abolished by any legislature, right? It made it it essentially was the kind of model for the Confederate Constitution as well. So between Mexico abolishing slavery in 1829 and the fear that would be enforced, and other limitations on immigration that Mexican government started to impose in the 1830s, that started the entire Texas secession movement. The larger point here, and I think where we have a lot to gain from looking closely at Texas, is this intersection, right? The intersection of essentially where Texas falls in American westward expansion or internal imperialism along the South. In other words, a kind of slave state version of American expansion. And that's what you're seeing in Texas, and actually starts to come into New Mexico history as well. And you have a complicated history up to the Civil War in New Mexico with the Oteros. So in any case, it's a chance where Texas could actually become kind of the Rosetta Stone, if you will, of two themes in 19th century American history: the legacy of slavery and the legacy of imperialism, or the legacy of conquest, as Patty Limerick called it.
Yeah, I would just add to what Dr. Ramos mentioned, is that, when Mexico had outlawed slavery in 1829, Tejanos here in San Antonio who wanted to curry favor with Anglo-American colonists who were coming from the U.S. South and were coming with enslaved people, basically sort of acted as Dr. Ramos mentions in his book as cultural brokers, and negotiated tried to or did successfully lobby for an exemption for Texas, and as long as it wasn't called slavery, right? And so that when the Republic of Texas is created, that's why I said it was re-legalizing, the enslavement of African people. And so I think that idea, should be front and center when we talk about this, when we talk about the founding of the Republic of Texas. If they want to look at documents, let's look at that Constitution. Let's really examine it. Let's have it in all. Let's make that a requirement for all 7th grade classes. In public schools. I teach Texas history here at the university as well. And some of the students that I teach are quite surprised that it was in the Constitution. And one of the things that I also wanted to sort of point out is, some of the comments on social media mention, why is it that so many Latinos, so many Mexican Americans are so in favor of keeping the slogan, right? And I would say, I think this speaks to the need for ethnic studies. This speaks to the need for Mexican American studies in public schools and and at the university level. As Raúl said, as Dr. Ramos said, the history of what's happened in Texas and how it was created, is very long, and sort of the criticism of this sort of master narrative that you get at the Alamo. Americo Paredes was saying this. He mentioned, he has this quip about if the Alamo hadn't existed, it would have been invented, right? Anglo-Texans would have invented it because it serves like this master symbol, as Ricardo Flores has mentioned. So I think it's important to also remember that there is this sort of pattern in Mexican American, history in Texas of organizations like LULAC, organizations like various groups that have tried to show their patriotism by not criticizing, by not criticizing the state, by not criticizing the state's history. And I think I would say that some of the football fans perhaps are perhaps being influenced by some of that as well, that past history that we don't get a critical history, or at least I didn't when I took 7th grade Texas history class. We didn't get a critical examination of our state's history. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. Dr. Gordon, I wanted to ask you about another project that you've been involved in. So the Eyes of Texas is not the only controversy that has hit UT's campus, particularly in the last couple of years, post-Charlottesville, post-George Floyd. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about this racial geography tour that you've been involved in.
Well, the racial geography tour is really not very recent. I started doing some version of that about almost 20 years ago. And it's just been building on itself. And what it speaks to what we're talking about here now, because the racial geography tour takes a tour through the built landscape of the University of Texas. And these landscapes are really wonderful, if you want to use that term, in the sense that they're curated landscapes and nothing is placed in position that isn't intentional. It all has meaning, it's intentioned, it's put there, and then it's preserved. So the racial geography tour reads those meanings in the built landscape. And really what it's trying to do is to show how race and gendered inequities are built into the historic landscape of a place like the University of Texas. And the real message is that if those kinds of things can be sedimented into the physical, it's called physical culture, or the physical built environment, they also probably are there as historic residues in the contemporary culture and social organization of the university. And what we need to do is to read them. In thinking about what Raúl and Omar were saying, one of the things that I believe is that the representations that people, many people, grasp onto in the present are not innocent of their past. In other words, they're not the folks who are grabbing onto them may not have a whole understanding of what that history is, but there's a whiff of that past that remains, which is part of what makes it attractive. So the Eyes of Texas, there are, I think as Raúl was saying, that there are probably many people, alumni, et cetera, from the University of Texas who can claim that they had no idea that this was originally sung in blackface. Probably not, but it had a whiff of that history in it. And if they had cared to scrape at all on the surface of that, they would have realized that. And that whiff of that past is also, I think, part of what makes it so attractive as a unifying force for a lot of these kinds of folks. And one of the reasons I can say that is because it's remarkable how stubbornly people are prepared to hold on to these things, even when they understand what that past has been.
So if you're interested in learning more about this, I'll put the link in the chat, but you can actually do kind of a version of this tour online now. Thank you. And Dr. Deloria,
Thank you for the plug.
Yes, of course. Dr. Deloria, I wanted to ask you, over the year, the thing with the Native American mascots has been going on for so long. And for so long, people have been asking, can you please get rid of these offensive stereotypes? And I just remember, it seems like some of the teams took these baby steps. Like I remember when they changed Redskins to Skins, as if that was somehow going to make it better. And I recognize they were responding to their fandoms, but what would you say to a fan who felt for some reason really connected to this team mascot, which is now look at as, wow, that's really offensive. What would you say to somebody like that who just thinks, but I just love that team. That's my team.
I mean, I think you can recognize and honor that a fan loves a team, and that's not the point of attack, right? That's not the place where you say you're wrong to love your team. I think that's the point of sympathy, where you say, I understand that. I got teams I love too. But, let's understand that, having come to know the consequences, and I think this is the same thing with the Eyes of Texas, you can sit there and say, well, I didn't know. But now that you know, right, you are challenged to act, right? I mean, and if your action is to say, yeah, I want to go back to the time when I didn't know, right? You're just being irresponsible as a human being, frankly. I mean, you're refusing to actually be a thinking person, right, in the world in which you operate. So I think the thing that we do when we're talking to fans like this is to say, like, I honor and I respect the love that you have for your team, and it's a positive virtue. But it has become associated with negative context, and contents, and knowing that those things are negative and that they have consequences for people. And I think this is one of the things that's really important in the mascot conversation, that is, I think, laterally transferable, is to say there are consequences for people. There are consequences for young people. It does harm. It actively does harm. And are you content to say that you want to go ahead and do harm? Does it mean that much to you? All right. Because that at the other side of it, right, you could change the name of your team, you could have different kinds of rituals, and guess what? You're going to find yourself being just as happy doing exactly the kinds of same things 5 years down the road with a different name, right? Because it's not the name that matters, it's the experience that matters. So, I mean, this is my sense of it. I wouldn't say that these things are super successful, though, right? People can't see themselves 5 years down the road embracing a new team name. But the fact is, it's happened over and over and over again, right? Texas Rangers, the quintessential case here, right, is Abe Pollin changing up the Washington Bullets, right, to the Washington Wizards basketball team, right? And he said, I don't want to be associated with bullets anymore. He came to know, right, that the meanings of bullets in Washington, D.C., right, a city of, of violence and racial violence, right? I don't want my team to be named that. And he's going to change the name of the team and create something new and something different and something better. And guess what? Did fans run away from the team? No, they didn't. They adjust. It's what we do,
Yes. Wow, that was really just a wonderful panel. And I have to tell you, I don't know how, but it's almost already 7:30 here. That went so fast, but I just want to thank you for sharing your knowledge with us tonight so that the public can know more about this history and better understand why are these things being questioned. And if it is your sports team, I hope that you will take these things into consideration. I also just want to share that we do have another event coming up in a couple of weeks, and it is a book club. We are going to be talking about a new book, West Side Rising, How San Antonio's 1921 Flood Devastated a City and Sparked a Latino Environmental Justice Movement. September 9th and 10th are the centennial of this flood, which had a devastating impact on the West Side. And so we will be talking about it with Char Miller, author of this long anticipated book. This is being hosted by the Maverick Book Club from Trinity University Press. I hope you will join us. If you like tonight's event, I encourage you to learn more about MACRI and how you can support our vision for a national center dedicated to preserving and disseminating Mexican-American civil rights history by visiting our website at www.somosmacri.org. There's more information for you on the screen. Thank you again, and good night, panelists. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good night.
Okay.